Okay. All right, team, we're going to get going. Grayson, are we live streaming now? We are live streaming, so behave yourselves. So I'm going to start by welcoming you all to the Strategy and Operations Committee for the 4th of March, and also welcoming via Zoom Councillor Pravanov, hopefully, and Councillor Randall. I can also see Mr Guy Burns and a few other participants. I'm not going to call them all out, but just welcome all to our meeting via Zoom. Hopefully you've read the email around the protocols. If you haven't, just have a check through that as we move through the agenda. Also welcome staff to the room as well. And from there I'm going to move to the council blessing. Is there anyone who would like to read the council blessing in particular? Councillor Holborough?
Ia mātou e whiriwhiri ana, ina take ke mua i o mātou aroaro. I pono ana mātou ka kaha tonu, ki te whakapau mahara huapai, mō nana hapori e mahi ne mātou. Me kaha hoki, hihiri, ka taia te arahi i te roto i te kutahitanga me te aroha.
Kia ora. Thanks, Councillor Holborough. So before we move on to apologies, I'm just going to hand the mic over to His Worship the Mayor, who has a brief statement that he wants to make. Over to you, Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the spirit of the Maori blessing this morning to remove the hara, as they call it, from this chamber, I'd like to make a statement in relation to the council meeting of Thursday, 25 February, in particularly the public speaking time in relation to the agenda item on the Urihi, the Kabari Gateway. At the beginning of the meeting, I outlined very clearly the protocols around my expectations of the behavior of all the people present in the room. I indicated that I would not tolerate inappropriate or offensive behavior and would act accordingly. However, since the meeting, I've been informed of behavior in the public gallery at the time that I considered to be both inappropriate and highly offensive. From where I was sitting and from the distance that I was at, I was not aware of it at that time. Had I been, I would have acted promptly in response. I make this statement today to ensure that there is a formal record of this inappropriate and offensive behavior being called out. Let me be very clear. There is no place for racism of any form here in this council chamber. Or indeed, there is no place for racism in our communities. As a council, we have an important role in showing leadership in the face of behavior that has no place in Aotearoa, New Zealand. None at all. This council chamber should be a safe place for anyone wishing to participate in the democratic process. Mana whenua should feel they can freely share their views and thoughts with the council in a constructive and welcoming environment that recognizes this partnership. It is clear to me now that this was not the case last Thursday. As a district, we will obviously face some very significant challenges and opportunities. In the months to come, there will be times when passionately held opinions and concerns will be expressed in this chamber. Today, on behalf of all the elected members, I offer my commitment that we must and will do better to create a safer environment in which those opinions can be expressed. And I'll be taking steps to talk to staff about structural changes in our relationship to enable this to happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Kia ora, Guru, and I tautoko your comments, and as an individual councillor, you have my support in what you have brought to the table today. So we're going to move on to item number 3, which is apologies. I am not aware of any. No, none have come through. And Councillor Elliott's just going to slip out during the meeting. So we're going to move on to item number 4, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. None have been brought to my attention. I'm going to quick look around the table. Councillor McCann.
Apologies for not sending you an email. Obviously, I have a conflict of interest on 8.1 and will be abstaining for voting but wishing to participate in the discussion.
All right, thank you, Councillor McCann, for identifying that. We haven't had a conflict for a wee while. Grayson, can you just remind me whether we need to just note that or we'll move and second it? Just noted, I thought it was as well. So noted, and If I forget, if you could just remind me when we come to 8.1, Councillor. And then we move on to item 5, public speaking time. I'm not aware of anyone that's come along this week. And so item 6A is public speaking time responses, and there is none. 6B, leave of absence. Anyone slipping away for a break? No. 6C, matters of an urgent nature, none have been brought to my attention. 7, updates, there is none. And so we're moving on to reports. 8.1, and welcome the ED team up to speak to this report. So coming up, ladies. So we've got Jamie and Leanna joining us this morning. Morning. I've heard great stuff about the work that you're doing. I understand Sarah from Elevate has been working with you and your team, and has had very good things to say about the team. So just pass that on while I've got you in the room. So over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It is that time of the year again when we start talking about our major event funding round, which is a little bit of a deja vu last year with our alert level changes. I've submitted the report, which is very similar to last year's, except that we have requested this year that the timings that we looked at last year are implemented this year, provided there are no COVID impacts and alert level 4 coming along. And we've requested that the panel that we used for the event funding round last time remains the same. So it's not particularly complicated or arduous. I'm happy to answer any questions around it.
Thank you, Jamie. Any questions from legal members? Councillor McCann.
Thank you very much for coming today. And just to be transparent, we've obviously discussed some of these questions that I thought councillors might be interested in. What is being done to investigate something that's been raised around council a few times to support smaller events, if you could tell the other councillors?
Sure. So the purpose of the Major Events Fund is that it was set up to encourage visitors to the region. The events decision-making matrix, it's classified into currently what's called a level, so we're looking at rephrasing that to tier to take away from confusion around COVID language. So the tier 1 and 2 levels bring in a significant number of visitors to the area. So from an economic development perspective, that's external money coming into the region. The smaller community events would sit under our tier 3 category. They tend to have very little draw for external visitors, and so therefore don't classify and qualify for the Major Events Fund. There isn't currently a fund specifically allocated for those community events. There are some smaller funds that events can apply to, creative communities, there's the community board funds and so on and so forth. But one of the pieces of work I'm working on at the moment is looking at an event portfolio type lens to our events that we support, and that would look at where those community events fit as well. So there is some work going on in the background around that.
Thank you. One of the other questions we've discussed is the publicity that's afforded major events. Could you possibly, through you, Mr Chair, explain to councillors whether we are able to support through publicity, etc., events that are not actually meeting the criteria, and how we can work towards a more cohesive strategy? Absolutely.
So as part of this work around the event portfolio lens, there's definitely going to be some events that fall into the category where they are potentially quite large events but are not delivered or financially supported by council, so they're outside of our work. And it's important that those events, because they are a draw card for our region, get some promotion through our channels. We have 2 quite distinct channels. One is the council comms delivered channels, which is very much about business as usual and functional communication, as well as some communication where it fits in around everything else that's going on around the council delivered events. We also have the kapiticoastnz.com destination marketing channel, which gives us a bit more freedom to promote some of the events that we potentially aren't actually involved in. A lot of the smaller events are shared across those channels, particularly the Love Local Facebook group. Alex and the team and I, any events that we come across anywhere in social media world that look like they may be of interest to Kapiti people, they will go in there. We also encourage events organisers to share their events there themselves. Part of this event portfolio work I'm working on will potentially frame up some of the conversations that we can have with comms team in particular about how we support those other potentially iconic events that council aren't involved in, such as the Kapiti Women's Triathlon and potentially a spearfishing competition, those large events that draw people from outside.
Just a couple more questions. One of the things you mentioned, and obviously we had to face last year, and again is COVID-19. Can you let councillors know what changes that are being put in place in the system to try and make sure that people are dealing with that?
So in terms of the process for the applications, Leanne and I discussed this today. We don't feel that alert level changes should change the timings this year for the major events fund, and part of that is because the funding is allocated from July, and event planners are planning, as we know, well out in advance. So an alert level change between now and the end of the funding round shouldn't impact on an event organiser's ability to apply. In terms of how we ask our event applicants or our fund applicants to consider COVID, we've actually Christchurch NZ have opened up their major events funding round. It's open at the moment, and they've got some really good examples of how COVID is factored into their application form. So what we've done is added that into our application form. We're asking event organisers to talk about how alert level changes will impact on the planning and delivery of their event. We're asking for key timelines so that they can say, at this point, we're going to either have to make the call to postpone or cancel or change. And we're also asking them to indicate to us how they're going to apply the Events Association Event Sector Voluntary Code, which is very much COVID responsive and should allow us to rest assured that our events organisers have considered the potential impacts of COVID on their event.
Thank you. One other question was around the fact that this policy expires essentially, or the funding. What work is being done to decide or bring that back to council to ensure that the funding for the events and for what we've seen as part of economic recovery continue?
Sure. So the long-term plan has the major events fund in it for a considerable length of time, and I've started the work with the policy team around how we look to ensure that the policy continues. It expires in June 22, so that work's underway already to carry on. So the funding is in the long-term plan.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you. Councillor Compton. Okay, thank you. I didn't see any further, so I'm going to ask a couple and I'll check the screen again if anyone has any. Great work, and I have seen Jamie sharing crazy not sharing crazy, but sharing like crazy on social media, the events, and not just the council events. So again, just good work. I think the process has been great. One thing that I experienced actually just this week in terms of the Māori Economic Development grants was the power from the decision to establish the Kotahitanga board and the grunt that comes with that, being involved in the Māori ED process. And I just wondered, I have got a question around workload, like whether there's value in considering a Kotahitanga member on the panel or as an observer. So I'm not too sure whether any thought has been given to that. The reason why is just like seeing through the Māori ED stuff, it's that that cross-pollination, the leveraging, the thinking of other channels in terms of funding or partnering. Maybe a discussion you want to have with them. I'm not set on the fact that we need to include anything today, but obviously if they would need to be a member, then that would need to be possibly need to be considered today. So I don't know if you wanted any. Leanna wants to have some.
Yeah, it's a conversation we haven't had with the board as yet, but I think the board's meeting next on the 15th of March, so I'm happy to get that added to the agenda and have that conversation with the board at that time.
Thank you. How would that play out in terms of recommendations today? Like I said, I'm not hell-bent on having it included in there. I think it just would be worth having the discussion. But if you spoke to them and they said, yeah, that would be great, we see value in that, if it's not in the recommendations today, does that preclude them from being involved?
Sorry, I wouldn't perceive so.
Thank you. The second one was just giving endorsement to Councillor Rob McCann should he wish to continue in his role on that panel, and apologies I haven't had a chance to check. I think, again, from my experience in being involved as an example with the Māori ED one 3 years or so in a row, you do bring value to the discussion with experience. So I haven't checked with Councillor McCann whether he wants to be the nominated councillor, but you'd certainly have my support if you did. I'm not too sure whether there are any other councillors that had interest, and we'll obviously come to that when we look at the recommendations. A quick look at the screen again. There's no other names down there. Any other questions from elected members? I'm just going to look to the Zoom participants. I have remembered. I almost forgot. Do we have any questions from anyone on Zoom, Grayson? Okay, so with that, team, if we could have a look at the recommendations on page 8. Recommendations 19 to 21. Councillor Buswell, do you want to move those?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to move them, thanks.
And seconded by Councillor Compton. Sorry, his hand first. Right of introduction.
Thank you for all your hard work, Jamie. I know it's been really difficult. It's been really difficult for that whole industry. So really pleasing to see that council can back these entities that bring so much entertainment, joy, and also a bit of a financial gain into our community. So yeah, thank you for all your hard work and keeping in touch with all of those people throughout this last turbulent 12 months, actually. And I know that they've really appreciated your support throughout that time, and also all your attentive action on Facebook and other mediums out there, just to keep everybody in touch with what's going on, and just to keep that that spirit alive out there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Councillor Compton, you're next. Before I do that, just those that are participating via Zoom, if you could signal to Grayson if you've got any comments to say in debate. Councillor Compton.
Yeah, I just want to echo the comments from Councillor Buswell and thanking staff for their work on this. I think we've seen over the last 12 months not only how important the work you've done has been to these event organisers, but actually how important these events are to our community as they've been coming out of lockdown and they're wanting to get out, wanting to get back involved in the community. And for those of us who were at the Electra Business Breakfast yesterday morning, we heard firsthand about the importance of Wellington on the Plate and all the events that they organise around that, and how people felt like they had been cooped up through lockdown and they just wanted to get out and do some stuff and be in their community. And the events that you and the team help other people put on are just a fantastic example of how, you know, our community's been able to come together and I guess celebrate the unique position that Aotearoa has been in over the last year. So, you know, big thanks to you all for that.
Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Jamie and Leanne and the team. Being an Otaki resident, I'm extra triple lucky because so many of these events are held in Otaki, and I just want to say how neat it is to have the entire community involved. It's really something that I think brings the whole place together, the Kite Festival and the Mariland Festival, and everyone seems to have visitors staying at their house those weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McCann. I've got Dem Services up on the screen. Did you want to have some comments there? Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay, so Councillor Randall, we're going to come to you next after Councillor McCann.
Well, in the words of Councillor Randall, I agree with everything that Gwen Compton has said. And I don't mean that facetiously. I would like to thank the staff for the tremendous amount of work. I'm very privileged to have been able to watch that from the inside. And I think that this particular fund and this work really not only adds to the economic vibrancy of our community, but also events like the ones that have been funded and the ones that aren't funded, add a great deal to our community and its vibrancy. So I really want to tautoko the work that you do. I also want to answer the Chair's comment that yes, I'm very happy and excited to have my name put forward and would accept that if councillors agree.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bernie Randall, welcome to the meeting. Hope you're doing well.
I'm fine. Yeah, I don't have a question. I was just going to vote on it, just waiting for the voting to take place.
Sorry, thanks, Councillor. So when we come to the right of reply, we'll then move to voting, and Grayson will just keep an eye out for the voting buttons which you have access to. So we'll note that, or Grayson will note that. So thanks very much, and I'll keep coming back to the Zoom participants as we move through. Thanks, Councillor. I don't see any further names up, so just a quick comment from me. Yeah, look, the last week or so has been pretty interesting with the gateway discussion, and the ED team have taken a bit of flack around the huge amount of staff that they have and what they do or don't do. And I think we've got an example here of the great work that is done within that team, not just in the event space, but in other areas as well. Jamie also mentioned the Destination Kapiti work as well in terms of the website and Facebook and Instagram and so forth. So again, just tautoko what everyone else has said, great work in the team, and just, genuine in that. And I met with Sarah Ferguson yesterday, and she had some, very good comments to pass on in terms of working with the team as well. So so with that, Councillor Buswell, did you have a right of reply? No, otherwise we're going to put that to the vote. So if you're via Zoom, just use the voting buttons, and Dem Services will keep an eye out for them. And Councillor McCann's just stepping back from the table because he is a nominated participant. And so all those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? And that is carried. And just checking, we've got those Zoom ones there, Grayson?
We've not got any indication on Zoom, so I'm presuming it's...
All right, we'll take that as a yes. There's no jumping up and down or fierce messaging in the chat section. So we're going to move on. The Zoom technology is still a bit new in terms of the flow of it, so we'll just move on to the next one. Just checking. Yep, that's great. And so, Jamie, thank you very much. And we'll move on to item 8.2. And welcome Sean up to the table. Thanks, Leanna. All right, and we've got Susan speaking via Zoom to the report as the writer of the report. So, fingers crossed, and have much joy with Zoom on Tuesday. So, Susan, hopefully you can hear us, and welcome to the meeting. And I'm just going to hand it over to you to talk to your report.
Kia ora. Is everyone able to hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Yep.
Perfect, thank you. If Council, the Strategy and Ops Committee are happy, I'll just take the report as largely being read, but there's just a few things that I'd like to draw to your attention. So the recently released National Policy Statement on Urban Development requires a removal of all minimum car parking standards from district plans, but territorial authorities can still consider the effects of a lack of provision. So in response to this, Waka Kotahi has provided guidance on how territorial authorities may be able to manage parking within this context. So our submission is basically centred around the fact that this guidance is to be welcomed, because it will help us in sort of supporting the development of our approach as we go forward. But we've got some areas that we would like additional sort of clarity or guidance on, and there's some concerns and some inconsistencies. But the inconsistencies are around the fact that some parts of the guidance suggests that we should be setting ensuring there's provision of car parking for industrial development on site, but by the same token we're required to remove those requirements, so kind of seeking some additional information around how that might work. The guidance also considers the ability or the approach of providing or enabling parking on streets where there isn't provision on site, but the national or New Zealand standards are very specific around different geometric design for different types of development, which doesn't necessarily support that approach, and the New Zealand standards are incorporated by reference in our district plan through the subdivision development principles and requirements document, so there needs to be some work in that area. Also identifies areas of work that would be requiring some additional resources potentially from council, with a little sort of understanding about where that additional resource come from, and that by that I mean the development of district-wide parking management strategies, data collection on parking supply and demand, including occupancy surveys and rates, how many people using the space per day, how long they're staying, which is obviously very difficult within the context of free parking without sort of considerable survey work. Origin destination surveys, which basically relies on stock cordons, which can be quite resource intensive. The development of area-based parking management plans, how we look at sort of prioritising and allocating spaces on streets, the ability to encourage that mode shift through development of infrastructure for other modes, looking at parking fee policies, obviously, and the cost of smart technologies to support some of those parking management approaches, and obviously there's the other issue related to enforcement. So there's lots of information in the document, and some of the areas we would prefer, or we would I'm proposing that we request further evidence to support some of those approaches that we might want to take forward. But also, like I said, just in terms of general resourcing of taking these things forward. So yeah, that was kind of a bit of a submission in a nutshell. So I guess if you're comfortable, I'll leave it to you to ask any questions you have of me.
Thanks, Susan. That's helpful, and good work on this submission. Then we'll have a look around and see what feedback there is from elected members. I just want to check with Sean before we move to the other councillor questions, whether you had any further you wanted to add.
Only that parking is a regular issue that comes through the organisation in terms of concerns from the community, but we are also in the process of updating those subdivision and development guidelines that Suzanne mentioned. So there's a project currently underway to look at those. So this document, once it's completed, would be used then to help advise those guidelines and whatever changes that might mean in terms of the district plan, potentially in what documents that then references with regard to advice to applicants moving forward. So other than that, no.
Thank you, Sean. I have a little bit. Sorry, yes, Susan,
Sorry.
Sure.
I just wanted to raise a point that Sean's just kind of reminded by saying what he's done, which is obviously there's also a potential link with the bylaw and making sure that the bylaw, when we bring that in front of you, is able to deal with the side of these approaches that support things like potentially residence parking, business parking, all that kind of stuff. So there's a link with the bylaw that will be put forward in front of you relatively, within the next few months as well.
Thank you, Susan. And before I move to His Worship the Mayor as the first question, from my perspective as a portfolio holder, as Sean has said, it's an area that's often comes with complaints, whether it be complaints from property owners and particularly commercial property owners around the cost and footprint that is taken up with having to provide car parks on a new development, The flip side to that is the complaints from residents when there's insufficient parking, or the other side, when parking is then dispersed onto the neighbouring streets. The analogy that I have is that the pebble into a pond creates lots of ripples, and every action has a reaction, and so more cars parking on the streets can create a more dangerous environment for cyclists, and that's alluded to in the report from Susan as well, but also the pressure on infrastructure, which is something that I'll raise too around the demand that it then puts on the team to provide more infrastructure. So I'll come to that through questions. But Your Worship, the Mayor, first up, and then Councillor Holborough.
Through you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is the national policy statement has come into effect on August 20th last year. And my understanding is the national policy statement supersedes the proposed district plan or any operative district plan. Given that it has already got effect, if I'm correct, we haven't developed the sort of tool set of maximum parking standards or anything of the sort to be able to manage any sort of the change that's already happened. The horse is behind the cart, so to speak.
I think the Mayor is staring straight at you, Mr. Chief Executive.
And I have another question to that.
Well, so yes, that change has been made, but we still can take those issues into consideration, and Suzanne may be able to respond to how we might be able to do that in terms of what we have in place at the moment. But yeah, those changes have, we are required to take effect of that NPS currently in terms of consent applications. So, and disregard, I guess, the extent of the parking requirements, but we still do have a number of other requirements in terms of accessibility and safety and other issues that we can take account of as well. So, but I don't know if Suzanne has anything further to add to that.
No, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Those the MPS requirements need to be taken into account and receive weight in the decision-making process. Councils have 18 months to remove those parking standards from their district plan, but obviously the MPS carries that weight. It's difficult because it's, you know, each consent is dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and as the MPS does enable us to consider those effects of parking on, you know, things like surrounding streets, etc. We have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis as they come forward. We are seeing some developments coming forward with a lower level of provision that we are than we've, you know, previously had identified in the plan. And so through transport assessments and the assessment of those assessments, that's how we're dealing with it currently.
Just handing over to the Chief Executive.
Now that you've heard the sort of practical things that we will have to consider, in my view, this is a nightmare that's going to play out really painfully. This is a national solution to a metro issue. And they're completely ignoring the realities. And it's been referenced in our paper, but I wouldn't probably put it so bluntly, so therefore it's just as well I didn't write it. Effectively, they're saying, philosophically, move to public transport and you won't need all the parking. And that's fine in a CBD area or where you have significant public transport connections. For us, you know, for 50% of the population, but 85% of the land area, this is going to be difficult. And councils are going to get held up as being obstructive and difficult if they don't let people do developments and require us to provide on-street parking to solve the fact that they don't have to provide off-street parking, potentially. So, yep, I see this playing out really, really painfully for places like Kapiti, and we won't have a choice.
Thank you for that optimistic outlook. Your Worship.
Yes. Right, thank you. Normally reds means stop, doesn't it? Ignoring the colour coding. Just following on what the chief executive said, so effectively what's happening is, again, the sort of unfunded mandate. What we are seeing here, am I correct? Which means there's a question mark. That the cost of providing car parks and the responsibility for it has been moved from the developer onto the public, into the council and hence the ratepayers, and the angst that goes with it, because street parking means we've got to make allowance for that. Having said that, just a comment that obviously what the government is intending to do is a long-term behavior change, and that means issues, pain will occur, and I can understand that. But so am I right that the cost has been moved into the public until such time as behavior change is done and people are more inclined to use public transport?
So at the level at which I look at it, yes. Sean might have an answer at a different level as well, because it's probably not as blunt as I put it. But at the level I look at it, yes, it's cost shifting to try and make things easier for development. It will also require the provision of much more public transport if you want to convince people to change, unless you're going to let them all go on e-scooters or something.
The only thing I would add to that, I guess, is the so in that we potentially have or had some ability to provide some contingency around parking with the previous district plan rules, that is now taken away. So in terms of enforcement and compliance, that will become much more of an issue in terms of managing the overflow from all of those from those potential developments, and whether that's, and there is, I guess, limited ability to provide further off-street parking or on-street parking currently. So again, yeah, it will intensify an issue that we already have in terms of the availability of parking, and as Susan's mentioned, providing information to support that around management plans and but also the enforcement aspect to it will become much more of an issue.
So, look, before we move to Councillor Buswell, do you mind if we just stick with him? Thank you, Councillor Holborough. In terms of feedback around the submission itself, we'll have some questions, and there might be some suggestions around including different matters in the. So we'll take that at the same time.
Sure.
Just to check. So we're open for questions, but if you do, I would like to include X, Y, Z into the submission. I think that it's been missed. Now's the time to raise it as a question as well. And so, Councillor Buswell.
Thank you. As a member of the Disability Advisory Group, I would just like to also echo the concern around mobility parking in Kapiti, and so I guess it's not so much of a question, but I would just, well, it is a question. Is there any way you think after this is passed that we could encourage more mobility parking and perhaps investigate the actual need? Because it's kind of highlighting that there's no real numbers identified in terms of need for mobility parking.
Am I able to respond?
You just jump in when you want to, Susan.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. So, yeah, it's an issue that myself and the district plan team are sort of grappling with at the moment. As I said in my submission, it relates to NZS 4121, which says that this is the requirement for mobility parking if you're providing other car parks, and there's the the inconsistency with the fact that potentially other car parks aren't going to be provided. So it's an issue that myself and the district plan team are currently trying to work through at the moment, and there's some potential ways of dealing with that. So yeah, hopefully that sort of that will come forward in the next few months.
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor McCann.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this question is going sideways slightly, but I think it's a great opportunity to ask a housing question. With the
Councillor Elliott.
I asked for that. With the NPS being active, Sean, we've got a conflict with, well, I perceive a conflict with the advice for those developers who are trying to increase the density. How are we dealing with that, given that it takes so long to build from where our current advice might be looking backwards, but that by the time they've actually built, the rules will have changed. Where are we at, and how is it working?
Did you want to do that, Sean? Yeah. So, so just in terms of going forward, every consent that we received post the MPS coming into effect, we are requesting transport assessments to identify some of the effects of the proposals and measures to mitigate that. So that's how we're addressing that at the moment. And the other issue, as Sean raised earlier, was our revision of the subdivision's development principles and requirements. So that provides council potentially with the opportunity that we move away from some of those standards in NZS 404, which council previously agreed as minimum engineering, and we replace, some of them with exceptions, and those exceptions can be around geometric design that potentially takes account of some of the impacts that there may be in terms of that on-street parking.
That sounds really reasonable, but it still worries me that there are people who are in the process now or had applied just before the NPS became operational, might be working towards the old standards. Would that be possibly true?
So some are working towards the old standards, and I think we need to bear in mind that despite the fact that the NPS is requiring that those minimum standards are removed from the district plan, it doesn't preclude the development industry from providing car parking spaces if they want to. So you would assume, I think, that a large supermarket would not operate without car parking until such time as we've got a good level of alternative mode. So despite the fact that the minimum standards are no longer in the plan, it doesn't preclude us identifying and considering the effects of that non-provision, or the development industry from providing those parking the parking provision if they want to.
Just got a comment from the Chief Executive.
I'd probably make 2 points. One is it's likely, although I'm not an expert in the consenting process, that if they really felt it was better for them, they could probably withdraw and relodge if they're not so far advanced. But actually the more pertinent point is they have to assess their potential market, and they need to provide housing, including all elements that go with it, such as parking and amenity, that they think will help them to sell their product. So it would be my view that if we jumped straight to medium density dwellings with zero parking, that might not necessarily result in good sales in this district at the moment. So I do think that there'll be a market-driven demand for a certain level of amenity to be provided that might well be over and above the minimum standard that they will need to consider.
And James, do you mind if I make a comment to that? Not entering into debate, just clarifying.
So I haven't responded yet. Look, more than happy, and I was just going to say, as long as we're not entering into debate.
Yeah, so to clarify, clearly I'm not talking about trying to support the market. I think the market is doing that without any help from Councillor McCann. What I'm referring to is social housing and the areas on the housing continuum that aren't supported by the market or by the current rules throughout New Zealand. So it's probably a little bit of a sideways discussion. But thank you, Mr. Chair, for your
Thank you, Councillor. We have Councillor Holborough up next, and then Councillor Elliott.
Yes, thank you. Suzanne, you said in your introduction that where we don't have provisions, we can manage through consents in terms of effects. How is that affected by the proposed changes to the Resource Management Act and a reduced kind of focus on effects and more centralised kind of planning and decision making? That's maybe a big question.
Good question. I'm not sure I have an answer yet. I don't think that we've, certainly I have fully thought that through yet. So yeah, I think that is going to be an interesting debate going forward. But yeah, I haven't considered that yet, to be honest.
We could have a look at that, but I guess, so this is just a guidance document from Waka Kotahi. It's not linked to the NPS or the RMA changes in any formal way. So, but we certainly that is an issue that we are concerned about. So, but yeah, there's a lot going on in that space, and as we understand more about that, I guess there'll be more of information coming back to council. But again, yeah, this is just a guidance document. I don't know what weight it would have. It will be used to advise us in terms of developing those other more formal documents, but don't believe it's linked in any way that we might look to implement any changes in that RMA space. But
so I think we should save that one, because I think it's a really big question. We should save that for our responses to the RMA changes and input in there to say, how are you going to address this issue through those changes, would be my suggestion. I take what Sean said. As a guidance document, it's not going to carry the same weight, and that question should be resolved as they look at the RMA, I think.
Thanks for that, Wayne. We have got Councillor Elliott next, and then Councillor Pravanov via Zoom.
So thank you. Firstly, I've got a number of questions, and I apologise for any duplication or repeating of anything that may have been said in the introduction that I missed. So firstly, on page 27, do councils have to pay to develop the parking strategy and a parking management plans, and are they mandatory, and do we do them already? It is suggesting here that we would decision make through those documents once they're developed.
I think, as Sean has pointed out, they're not mandatory. It's guidance that's been produced by Waka Kotahi in an effort to help us to try and address the effects of the removal of the MPS, the removal of parking standards as a result of the MPS. Obviously, that does take some resource, and so that's one of the questions that I've obviously raised in the submission, is how do we resource that? This particularly is something that perhaps we might not have thought about necessarily in the past. I
think that's adequately covered at 1.2, Councillor Elliott, in your submission.
Yeah. Susan, the Hastings pricing survey on page 29 is a little bit of an interesting exercise. It was user pays versus rates funded.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to question possibly more to CE staff. Is that the sort of question that we want to include in this year's LTP document, if it's not too late, or maybe for even next year? Just to throw a question out there so we have some sort of response from the public.
I'd say it's too late to add that in at the moment, because we've already submitted the consultation document for audit review. Okay. But it's certainly something we could consider as part of an annual plan next year.
Okay. I'm a little bit interested in the development design. So page 10 talks about New Zealand Standard 4404, which one developer, it says, has used already in Kapiti for those developments that have roads that are far too thin for any parking. And knowing them from another area and having a family car and a family trade contractor's work vehicle written off through being reversed in these subdivisions while there were houses established and houses being built. Are we going to be continuing to use that standard, or allowing developments to that standard here in Kapiti?
I think that relates to that ability to, or our current proposals to review the subdivisions design principles and requirements document. So that's the one that references New Zealand Standard 4404, and through that document says that these are the minimum standards that we accept. So there are areas of this subdivisions development principles and requirements that provide exceptions to those standards, and so through that process we can consider that geometric design. But there will be other requirements to consider the knock-on effects of that in the district plan, and whether that's sort of is consistent with perhaps some of the other design guides that we've got in there. So it's a question of sort of working that through with the district plan team around what changes do we want to make through the SDPR, and how do we address those consequential amendments in the district plan that are required as a result.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So a little bit same thing on design. The current formula we have of a property boundary with a fence, a grass berm, a footpath, possibly another grass berm, and then the verge and the drainage and culvert work, and then the road. Is that prescribed in New Zealand standards, or is that something that we can quite easily change to add rain gardens and other features to make use of that land space?
So the New Zealand standards, the geometric design depends on the development that's taking place. So, you know, a smaller residential area will have a different level of design to a, you know, larger sort of town centre type road. But yes, we can, through the SDPR, look at those design aspects. That's the purpose of that document. And certainly we're seeing consents coming through that include elements like rain gardens as a way of addressing the requirement to provide hydraulic neutrality on site. So those are already coming through the consent process, and the stormwater team are sort of addressing those as and when those consents come forward.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, because that sounds really good, because I also read on page 81 that they make a statement that parking area, an area set aside for parking in developments, takes up more land area than any other single element. But I could suggest that in our submission that we oppose that statement, because I would think here that if we looked at our maps that we would find that land area set aside for hydraulic neutrality and ponding would take up far more area in Kapiti than parking space.
It depends. It depends on the design feature that they use. So permeable paving, for example, could be one option, which obviously then you can still park on. But that's kind of why I've actually asked for further evidence in that regard for districts like Kapiti. I mean, looking at the maps, the town centres are obviously probably about that, but I've asked for further information on that figure for districts like Kapiti.
Oh, look, thanks, Susan. It's a really, really good submission you've made, and thank you. It's the end of my question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Elliott. So we have got Councillor Pravanov via Zoom, and then Councillor Compton. Morning, Jocelyn.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning, James. How are you?
Thank you.
That's good. So I just want to, I've got a question around developers and what their, I suppose, what they need to do. And I suppose I'm looking specifically on rest home development, whereas this is not really talked about in this paper. So there's lots of stuff about, you know, town centre parking, residential street parking, but nothing in that area about retirement villages. And I suppose, you know, I'm sort of thinking back to when Ryman's was built and the lack of parking within the complex there, and then either workers or other people being forced to park on the local streets. And obviously there's an application for a big Somerset development in Waikanae, and there has been a lot of concern raised about people parking, particularly along Park Road. And I suppose I'm wondering whether this is actually going to exacerbate that problem because of, you know, the developer not potentially, but basically reducing the amount of parking within it, you know, such as, you know, such a retirement complex as this.
Excellent. So we'll check with Susan.
So I guess I've got a couple of things. Firstly, you know, I can make sure that we raise that issue of retirement villages through our submission, if that's what you'd like me to do. And secondly, in terms of the Somerset development, there is a rather large and thick transport assessment that has been submitted as part of that that proposal that we have sought further information from them on. So that's at the stage where we're just waiting for that further information to come in before we can continue to assess that application.
Thanks, Susan. So, Councillor, two things there. One is around the submission. Susan's noted that, and Sean's giving the nod as well, that will include some commentary around the provision of rest homes and parking within. The second one, and I'm just going out on a limb here, in my knowledge, if it's regarding the Somerset, there'll be a consent process there and so forth. There'll be expectations around parking provisions and traffic assessments. So that will be just managed within the normal operational framework within council in terms of considering the impacts on the surrounding environment. I'm sure you can check with the team offline further about that once it's sort of gone through the process. Did you have any further questions, Jocelyn?
Yes, so just on that matter, I was just wondering whether, Sean, you could make some comments about, what input the public can have about their provision for parking?
Sorry, I'm not really sure how, in terms of the paper today that relates to the...
well, I suppose...
Not
and we won't really know
okay,
until
it's probably, I'll just leave that. And,
I think it's probably better, Jocelyn, because also we don't really, well, not so much we don't, staff don't really know until they've got a full application, and I don't know if they have or haven't, and so forth. So I think it's probably better that we park that one. Did you have any further on the paper itself?
No, thank you. Just basically raising, that the fact that that type of development isn't actually included in here, and because, like, obviously in 20.22, it actually talks about a whole lot of detail, and it'd be good to know whether that also applies to retirement villages.
Thank you, Jocelyn. For everyone sniggering at me, parking something is a cheering term. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Elliott is pointing to something. I'm not too sure quite what it is.
7, where there is a flow chart of it includes public engagement.
Thank you, Councillor. Helpful. Councillor Compton, I'm moving to you, but I was just checking that Councillor Bravanov's finished. If Jocelyn, if you have anything further to add, just let Grayson know. Councillor Compton.
Thank you, through the chair. First, I just want to admire the confidence that we have in the submission that everyone parks exactly 11 centimetres out from the curb. I wish that was the case. But actually, on a related...
Remind me to show you a photo from Aotaki later.
In terms of NZS 4404, does that also define the minimum footpath width that goes along that road?
I guess there's a couple of things. Yes, it does talk about footpaths, but there's also other standards through pedestrian, planning guidelines that talk about minimum widths of 1.5 with a 2.5 for a shared path. So there's a couple of standards that kind of are relevant, I guess, when we're considering and providing comments on consents relating to the development of new footpaths as part of a wider road network.
Because, I guess where I'm going with that is if you have a situation where in these new developments that you have a whole lot of vehicles parked out on the road and you've got cyclists and scooterists and whatnot trying to get through, having cars on the road makes that immeasurably more difficult. So unless you're putting in on-road cycleways or having mandatory 2.5 metre shared pathways, you've got that sort of area. So we're wanting to encourage people into active modes of transport, but then sticking a whole lot of cars on the road is going to deter them from doing that. So I think that's one thing that I think could be strengthened in the submission about how we actually say when you're looking at NZS 4404, you need to actually consider ensuring that you strengthen the provisions around those minimum mandatory footpath widths.
Thanks, Councillor. And I think it's sort of agree and referring to the point earlier that I made around those tensions that come with the other. Susan, you're pipping Sean at the post. He's feeling a little bit left out here. It's like a game show where it's like first to the buzzer.
Sorry, Sean. It's really difficult when we're in a different room.
Would you like to add anything, Sean?
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I was just going to... NZS 4404, I guess, is a base New Zealand standard that covers water, provision of water, wastewater, stormwater, road, all of those elements of subdivision, and sets, I guess, a minimum sort of engineering standard. But there is also, and most councils do have their own set of additional requirements that supplement NZS 4404, and that's the subdivision development principles and guidelines that we are looking at updating to reflect some of these issues around the need to provide more wider footpaths and other changes in legislation that we now need to reflect in that document. So yes, we can look to take that into effect, but it then again adds more cost to those developments in terms of provision of wider footpaths, and to council, I guess, as well in terms of that.
They are saving money on garages though.
Thank you. Councillor Compton, did you have any further questions?
No, that was it.
Thank you. My daughter would say Sean's flexing with his immense knowledge and experience. Councillor Elliott, did you have a further question?
Yeah, just in regards to what you've just said, Sean, we've also adopted our age-friendly cities strategy, and so does that mean that that also has to segue in any design recommendations, and that are also, how are they taken into consideration alongside that discussion,
Chair, I wasn't not aware that we've adopted that strategy yet, or that it's actually in the strategy policy work program to be developed, but there are a significant number of other standards that link to accessibility and that we use to reference when we're carrying out transport assessments and the like. So because that strategy is likely to be a accumulation of a lot of that already exists in terms of what we consider when we're looking at subdivisions.
So I haven't got any other names on the screen. I will come back to Zoom. Got some for myself, having not had a chance to see this just with the tight timeframes. So Susan, I'll leave it up to you where you think these fit in, and apologies if I've missed it somewhere else. I was sort of looking at 1.2, but again, if you think it fits somewhere else, just reinforcing the increased infrastructure investment and requests to council to facilitate boat shift. So that's a significant cost there that we could incur through responding to that. We list all the other stuff that we could incur, but I think that's missing, and it's probably one of the bigger ones.
Okay.
And then the next one is around, I'm noting sort of where have I picked it up on, but again, if you feel it fits somewhere differently or it's covered somewhere else. You've referred under 1.4 the financial assessment needed from the government, and obviously just that financial pressure on the district. And I wondered whether you could strengthen that and explain more the impact on rates through, in the words of His Worship the Mayor, the unfunded mandate. But in doing that, also defining our community just through the work that Brandy's done previously around social deprivation and so forth. So, because my worry is when you read through and it just refers to Kapiti residents, again, we've heard time and time again that Wellington considers us as probably more of an affluent, wealthier community and misses those Otaki particularly, but pockets in Paraparaumu, and now we hear Waikanae West as well. So I think to provide some context around those aspects of our community would be helpful.
Yeah.
And also under 1.5 as well, when it talks about smaller towns and rural areas, actually providing further context around defining, and that sort of goes to what the Chief Executive referred to as well, around the lack of public transport in those areas, which I think is probably covered elsewhere in the submission. I'm not too sure. Normally I read the submissions a couple of times and I only had time to read it once this time. Whether this is covered here, but just a stronger emphasis on the result of this in our district would be the requirement for more public transport options, and for that to give influence or direction to Greater Wellington Regional Council. So this, in effect, or the work that they do, would help send a very strong signal or message to in our area, GWRC, around the demand or need for public transport. And looking through, that is all that I had to include. So I just want to have a quick check around whether there is any more feedback from elected members, and Grace, and whether there's any feedback from Zoom. No? Excellent. And I can't see any more around the table. So I'm going to move to the recommendations on page, just jumping through my agenda here. Recommendations team is found on page 11, recommendations 27 and 28. Do we have someone that would like to move? And I just wondered whether it's got the approved minor editorial. So looking for a councillor, not everyone rush all at once. Councillor Elliott, moved and seconded by Councillor McCann. Right of introduction.
Look, thank you very much for the staff for your work on this submission. One I'll be following with interest. It is a little bit of, I think, an umbrella solution to where we all have very individual needs in our communities. And yes, we will be watching. I thank you for your changes. And I would possibly just want to mention that snapper cards, we're trying to encourage public transport. We've got college children and they still only have 3 places in the entire district where they can top up a snapper card. That's the biggest reason in our family and many Otaki families why suddenly the parent has to get in a car and drive 50-kilometre round trip.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Buswell, and just reminding those on Zoom if you want to join debate. Councillor Buswell.
Thank you. Thank you for doing the submission, and I guess this is a huge problem for our community. It's always a bit of a sore point, and I just really hope that when this does come to fruition and it is implemented. I know it's only a draft at the moment, but further down the track, I really hope that we've got some very strong comms around this. And how we work with our community to make sure that everyone's aware of the changes and that they're not necessarily our choice, but once again, one of those things that the government's put on us.
Thanks, Councillor. And I had the same question around comms too, so maybe if we could have that covered off at the end of debate by staff in terms of if there is a plan there. So, Councillor Compton.
Yeah, just to support what's been said about acknowledging the work staff have put into this report. It's one of those. You can get down quite in the weeds of this sort of thing, but I think a lot of the tension that we're seeing play out around that is where Kapiti, as a fast-growing district that's part of Wellington, is counted as one of these Tier 1 urban authorities, but we're not a Wellington metro city, and that means we don't have all the same public transport options, and that investment isn't necessarily coming our way. And I think it's highlighted in the submission about the lack of rail north of Waikanai, the lack of bus shelters, especially in Otaki, the lack of bus services there. So I think the aims of what the government is trying to achieve, the heart is in the right place. It's about that head part, is how do you actually make this feasible? And the question is, what's coming first, the chicken or the egg? And it's very difficult, I would think, to build all these new subdivisions with on-street parking if the buses aren't running there already, or if there's not trains nearby for people to get to. So I think staff have done a really good job of reflecting that in the submission, and we can just sit here and fingers crossed that we get listened to for a change.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'm just checking with Grace. It doesn't look like there's anyone on Zoom. Just taitoku what everyone else has said. Fantastic job, Susan, in terms of the submission. And thank you for your time today to present the report via Zoom. I don't see any further discussion, so right of reply, Councillor Elliott. If not, then we'll move to the vote. That's been waived, so we're going to put that to the vote. Councillors that are via Zoom, feel free to use your voting buttons. And so all those in favour say aye. Aye, against, and that is carried. I'm just looking at the time, team. We've been going for just over an hour. Do we want to stop for a short 5-minute break before we go into the next, or do you just want to crack on through and get the meeting done and dusted? Oh, Councillor McCann's already starting to hear. The union delegate says yes, so we're going to stop for 5 minutes. If you're on Zoom, we're just going to grab a coffee break, and we'll be back in at 1:45 or just a little after.